All right. But there is no reason, okay? And again, this is kind of his response to Baxter. If he was to respond to Baxter, this is what he would say. There is no reason not to allow a lake, river, forest, etc., or walled pond, right, to prove damages to fragmented, causally remote, and unrepresented human interests as the prima facie measure of damages to it. Okay? The lake is the prima facie measure of damages to it. Not, for example, if you own a tourist company or something and want to take people out in the lake and now it's got a big oil spill on it or something and you can't anymore, right? The lake, the damage to the lake is the fairest and most objective measure of damages, right? Right? By doing so, we make the natural object through its guardian a jural entity competent to gather up these fragmented and otherwise unrepresented damage claims and press them before the court. Legal guardians of the lake damaged by the paper mill can in this way serve simultaneously as guardians of the interests of future non-human and human generations, as well as of the interests of otherwise unrepresented but distantly injured contemporary humans. Okay? All right, and then the example I keep going back to is these giant energy companies that are profiting, getting just obscenely wealthy from their filthy business model that they've got us all addicted to. But think of all the indirect remote damages caused to humans by energy companies. Under the current legal economic system, these damages are very, very, very rarely paid for by the energy companies. Under Stone's guardianship system, courts will be empowered to assign a monetary price to these damages by calculating what it will cost to make Earth's atmosphere and oceans whole again. And yes, these are dramatic, deeply dramatic, and totally revolutionary, which is what we need. The old systems, it's time for it to go. It's done with. Don't get too radical here. I could. Anyway, I don't want to offend anybody viewing from their living room. I like my lectures. I've been getting addicted to them, actually. Isn't that a trip? I never used to enjoy watching my own lectures, but anyway. I hope you're enjoying them too, but I watch them. I only have one subscriber. I think I doubled my subscribers. I think I got one other one, so now I have two. And I don't even put my name up there. My name's not on there anywhere. And I need to put the syllabus in there. I need to put the readings, for each lecture. I haven't done any of that. But they're up there. And that's really the only social media that I use. I don't use any of that other junk. Facebook, Twitter. This is my life, man. This is what I do here in front of all 36 of you. This is what I care about. This is my passion. So I have a YouTube channel. And the PSU administration says, because this is just a humanities class, and that's just artsy-fartsy subjective stuff, I can put it on YouTube. Whereas if I was an engineering professor, then they wouldn't let me do that. So hooray for the humanities. And there's a hell of a lot more value in the humanities than there is in anything else. So yeah, go ahead.
So wouldn't all of this just require a great deal of education? Because even in the dire state that we are now, where our climate is dramatically changing, we all know this, there's still people who call that a belief. Like, how would we actually be able to go about this without, even if it's a jury court, you're still going to have half the jury who might not even believe in global climate change and that this is not a real thing.
It would be just an opportunity to educate people. Expert testimony, you got the most intelligent people of their generation available to testify. I'm sure James Hansen, former director of NASA,
right.
He ought to be appointed guardian. And he'd say, yeah, man, he'd sign me up. And no, I think you're missing it. It's true that we live in a country that elevates ignorance to an art form, and that's a disability, clearly, in our culture. But we also have a great deal of faith in science. People in our country generally are persuaded by people like Hansen and Neil deGrasse Tyson, right?
Yeah, no, I know. I'm familiar with that.
Bill Nye, the science guy.
Wouldn't that even remove the normal citizen from the legal system even more so, and add like another layer of obscurity from actually having access to doing this? Because you would need an education to be able to really partake in it?
Yeah, maybe.
I don't think so.
No?
The burden of proof would be on the corporations to, prove that they're not polluting, so therefore, it'd be much easier to prove that you are. So what would happen at almost overnight would be the distribution of wealth if these companies took in more regionalism, and if there's more distribution of wealth and education and everything else down the road would be, like, there's not this gap that you're talking about. So, I don't know.
All right, we've got a little bit of tough meta-ethical work that I want to try to extract out of Stone. To try to, I want to give him kind of a treatment that we're giving to Leopold too. Just keep our little natural resource values chart in mind, and remember that both Stone and Leopold occupy these nebulous, ambiguous positions on our chart that are somewhere between a Group B conservationist all the way up to a neo-Kantian ecocentrist. So Stone is somewhere on there, and so is Leopold, and so are a lot of radical environmentalists like Edward Abbey. Edward Abbey's probably a lot more. He's such a misanthrope that it's easier to identify him as he's a hardcore. I'm not even going to say more than anthropocentric. He's just a non-anthropocentric. He doesn't want anything to do with people. He says he'd rather shoot a human being than a rattlesnake. Anyway, of course he's not serious, but he was a very sweet guy, from what I can tell about his life. Very kind. Anyway, all right. But he was really radical, right? He talked about monkey wrenching, right? Just tearing it up, man. Just committing that, damage, property damage to these damn drillers and frackers. Which I'm not advocating, all right? That would be, if I was to advocate that, I'd have to countenance the reduction to instrumentalization, reduction to instrumental status of somebody, and I can't advocate that. So you have to be utilitarian to go with monkey wrenching, as far as I can tell. And I'm not a utilitarian, so take that. I'm not promoting that sort of thing, not even close. In fact, I'm strongly opposed to it. But those radical environmentalists, when they start doing property damage, they totally discredit themselves, as I understand anyway. But anyway, I'm still undecided about all that stuff too. Sometimes I cover that actually in my class. Sometimes I cover that debate about anyway. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to push this just a little bit farther. I'm thinking about like a cigarette company. Like I can't sue a cigarette company when I get lung cancer for smoking their product. How would that not be something?
Well, actually people did.
Well, they did, but then they started putting the thing on there, right?
Yeah.
So I'm now committing to getting lung cancer when I smoke the product. Now,
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be the same thing of a power company putting a warning on turning on a light switch?
It could be, but we're talking about past action. The evidence coming up that the New York Attorney General, Eric Schneiderman, I think his name is I forget his name. Anyway, he's the Attorney General. They have a very active Attorney General in the state of New York that has been investigating ExxonMobil lately, and it's become clear that they knew perfectly well.
Yeah, since like the 60s.
And yet they suppressed. So it all kind of depends on exactly what evidence emerges. But if they did suppress all this evidence of climate disaster, then they could be held liable, the way the tobacco companies were held liable. Those tobacco companies should have been put out of business. I don't know if any of them were, but anyway. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say in regards to the electricity with the warning label kind of thing, I think that's not exactly comparable, because electricity is, and even like petrol is kind of more of it's a utility and it's a publicly accessible thing, whereas with cigarettes you have to be of a certain age to buy them, and that's just from like a strict utilitarian kind of legal thing. I don't think that they're necessarily comparable. So I don't think in that instance that's necessarily a concern.
You can buy gas when you're like 15. You can buy gas whatever age.
Yeah.
You could say you could put a label on that saying that it's hurting the environment, but
I don't think that would cover it legally.
I think what if they're going to be accused of anything, they're going to be accused of I'm sorry, we got to move on. Stone argues
the economy though. It's not the consumption; it's the extraction that they're going after. So it's not
the waste. It's just unbelievable.
It's not the damage that the gas does to the inside of your car or motor.
What happened to that big methane leak down in Southern California, where all those people got sick and had to move for Christmas? Do you guys follow that? What's going on with that? They haven't stopped it yet. It's taking them months. It's going to take them months to get in there.
Very quiet.
There's more than 25% of all the methane releases in the entire state of California for the last 4 months have been coming from this one place. where it's an underground storage facility, some giant storage facility, and it's right in a nice upscale neighborhood. It's right adjacent to a really upscale neighborhood. It's not too far from LA. It's in LA County. Anyway, but all these people were getting sick, you know, literally just vomiting and horrible sicknesses. So they had to move because this methane is leaking all over the place. And they don't know how to stop. I mean, they're going to stop it, but it's going to take a long time. Anyway, it's just unbelievable how much goes on. When I was a kid, I used to just cringe when I'd be riding in my parents' car and I'd see one of those big diesel trucks, you know, when they shift gears or something, and a big giant black cloud goes up. I would just, how could that be right, man? That seems wrong, you know. Some big black cloud, and then I think of this giant cloud of methane coming out of the ground in LA, and God, man, it's just unbelievable. It can be very depressing, you know, but our task, you know, is to lead honorable lives. And that's what philosophy can help us do. In the wake, you know, in the face of all this, you know, we can still lead honorable lives. And we can still lead active lives, not reacting. Utilitarians are always reacting, right? The secret is to find out, you know, find your power so that you can just act and assert, right? Anyway, Stone argues that his non-human natural entity guardianship system, if implemented, would establish a more effective, more fair, right? That's what he's saying. It's more fair by creating new property rights attached to natural entities themselves, all right? And this is kind of a breathtaking assertion. Qualities such as health, this may be what he's saying. This is the neo-Kantian, non-consequentialist interpretation of what he's saying. Qualities such as health, notice I use 3 of these are Leopoldian terms. Health, integrity, stability, and beauty would be properties, and are, metaphysically are. They just are. They might be. That's what a neo-Kantian would say. They are properties owned by the natural entities themselves. Okay? So that's where we get all, you know, you cannot own the earth, right? You remember the words of Chief Seattle. You cannot own the earth, you know. The earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth. That's metaphysically more accurate than the statement that the earth belongs to us. We don't own the earth. The earth owns us, and the earth owns her or his or its own health, integrity, stability, and beauty. Humans who destroy or damage these properties would be legally compelled to compensate the entities directly by paying into a fund an amount necessary to make the entities whole again. In other words, make them healthy, integrated, stable, and beautiful. Stone draws comparison with other historic property rights, and these are fair, totally fair comparison if you think of the effect that these innovations, these different kinds of innovations had on our legal / political / economic systems. Then, I mean, just think of a time before tort law. Think of a time before patent law. The political, economic, legal landscape looked completely different, and people were empowered, right? Power. Each of these innovations involved pretty dramatic shifts in power, in legal power, right? And he's saying we need an equally dramatic legal shift in legal power, you know, legal shift in power, right? We need to empower ecological wholes. And again, responding to the sort of objection that Baxter might make, Stone notes that all damage estimates, whether estimates of damages to humans, for example, pain and suffering, right? That's how do you calculate pain and suffering? Come on, right? When you get, you know, it's always the neck, right? If some stupid driver, it's an expensive car, hits you on your bike, just fall over, you know, and grab your neck, right? It's always the neck that hurts, right? It's a fancy car, right? You know she's got deep pockets. So anyway, you got your neck's hurt, right? And then of course that's very expensive. And then, but on top of that, you have all this pain and suffering, right? It hurts just to stand up, it hurts to sit, it hurts to sleep, everything. But that's so nebulous. And yet courts all the time, this is Stone's point. This is just routine. It happens every single day, thousands and thousands of times every day. Courts make pain and suffering calculations, and they award damages to victorious plaintiffs, right? Plaintiffs who win their case, they get damages for their pain and suffering, if that was one of their claims, all the time. So to say that, you know, courts are now having to make determinations that are just too difficult to make, no, come on, they make difficult determinations all the time. In fact, determinations that are much more difficult than the ones that Stone is asking them to make about ecological wholes. All right, so Stone ultimately wants to argue that this transformation of our economic and legal system is going to be of tremendous psychological and sociological benefit to human society as a whole. and to individual humans too. But let's pause for a moment here, and because this is kind of how Stone sets up his reasoning. And let's ask again, which type of argument is stronger? And by stronger, I just mean more effective. Stronger could also mean more true, but often true is also what is effective, you know. Anyway, what kind of argument is more effective, do you think, tends to appeal to more people? We are obligated to protect non-human natural objects because doing so is good for us. Or, we are obligated to protect non-human natural objects because doing so is good for them. Baxter, Norton, and Wilson, you'll recall, all argue that the first type of argument is much stronger. Okay? They're all very politically oriented thinkers. Baxter's a law professor. Norton worked most of his career inside the Beltway as an environmental policy analyst. Wilson, as you know, he's just a champion of biodiversity. He just wants to do anything he can to save as many critters, as much biodiversity as he can. So he's a very political guy too. And they all say that appeals to human self-interest are the strongest. They are the most effective way to move people, right? Stone disagrees, okay? In a really important sense, but in the end, maybe he doesn't disagree. All right, let's see. Stone says, and here's one of his huge hints to the idea that maybe ecological wholes have moral status. Maybe that's what he's arguing. The time is already upon us when we may have to consider subordinating some human claims to those of the environment per se. That just means in itself, right? That's Latin for in itself. Those of the environment in itself, right? Sounds a lot like a non-consequentialist kind of a claim, right? I myself, he says, feel disingenuous, rationalizing the environmental protectionist position in terms of the utilitarian calculus, even one that takes future human generations into account, like Norton's, right? Those who favor development have the stronger argument, okay? If we're reduced to utilitarian calculations, then the extractionists and the developers have the stronger argument. So maybe we shouldn't agree to play on their field, right? Those who favor development have the stronger argument if we're playing on a utilitarian field, right? They at least hold the protectionists to a standstill from the point of advancing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. But when conservationists argue this way to the exclusion of other arguments, they reinforce anthropocentrist perspectives, and there is something sad about the spectacle. He means there's something sad about the spectacle of an environmentalist framing the issue that the environmentalist cares about in the terms of the developer, right? In the terms that a developer or a resource extractionist would prefer to use, namely the utilitarian, even more narrowly the economic terms, right? One feels, so that's kind of sad, right? Seeing that, an environmentalist. One feels that the arguments lack even their proponents' convictions, right? The environmentalist who argues on utilitarian grounds, on anthropocentric grounds, lacks the courage of her own convictions, right? Because really inside she believes in her heart usually that the reason we want to protect an old growth forest or a salmon run is because it has intrinsic value, or because it's not just for us, right? One feels that the arguments lack even their proponents' convictions. I expect they want to say something less egotistic and more emphatic, but the prevailing and sanctioned modes of explanation in our society are not quite ready for it. And then he says, for my part, I would prefer a frank avowal that even making adjustments for aesthetic improvements, what I am proposing is going to cost us. In other words, it's going to reduce our standard of living as measured in terms of our present values. Okay? So yeah, we have to sacrifice, and we have to sacrifice for more than anthropocentric reasons. So then we get around to the selfish question, though, which everyone ends up having to ask, right? And which the philosopher has to consider too. It's an odd question, Stone says. What's in it for us when we go around trying to, when we protect ecological wholes? What's in it for us? Stone says, well, that's an odd question, because it asks the environmental ethicist to justify her position in the very anthropocentric, hedonistic terms that she is proposing to modify. All right? There's some irony in this. Stone mentions Kant, and he mentions Socrates. This is really some heavy-duty philosophy that Stone's laying out for us here. But it's all kind of, sketchy, right? It's real rudimentary. It's not. Anyway, the irony of ethical argumentation is observable in both Kant and Socrates. Note, what's common about both Kant and Socrates? They're both hardcore non-consequentialists, okay? All the philosophical greats. Was Jesus a utilitarian? Oh man, he was a Unitarian. That's a joke. Anyway, he wasn't a Unitarian. What kind of... Anyway, my dad was a utilitarian minister. No. Anyway, he was a scientist. But anyway, these guys are both hardcore non-consequentialists, okay? They're both, they're the kinds of philosophers, that have a lot of moral fiber, you could say. They're not utilitarians. They're the opposite of utilitarians. And yet they both end up appealing in the final kind of analysis to consequentialist reasoning to explain why, for example, in Kant's case, you always have to keep your promises and you always have to tell the truth. All right? Now, we explained why you must do those things on non-consequentialist grounds, right? He's a non-consequentialist thinker. But when you press him, he will end up defending promise-keeping and truth-telling as being prudentially the best course of action, too. All right? And then Socrates, who always argued that morality and virtue are valuable in themselves for their own sake, with no promise of personal reward, when Thrasymachus asked him why he should try to cultivate personal excellence in himself, Socrates replied by saying that if you pursue immoral behavior instead of morality and virtue, then you're going to be miserable. Okay? Which again is a consequentialist reason to follow certain principles, right? To become virtuous, to strive for virtue. So Stone, in the in the last analysis, he says, it is to psychological, I think that's how he writes it, psychological appeals to the listener's self-interest that hold sway, however principled the rhetoric may be. Okay? It's always psychological appeals. What's in it for me ends up actually persuading the most people, so I guess he ends up agreeing in an important sense with both Baxter, Norton, and Wilson. All right? So, and these are the benefits that he's referring to. He said, okay, well, what are the benefits? He's saying, okay, the benefits are enormous, right? So now we want to know what they are. Why should we do this? It's going to benefit us, he says, right? It's not just morally the right thing to do, damn it. It's also going to benefit us, right? I always stand my right leg. I got to start standing my left leg. I think I'm developing the muscles differently. Anyway, the new conception of humanity's relationship with nature, inaugurated by recognizing legal rights in non-human natural entities, would be a first step toward solving the world's environmental crises. This new conception of humanity's relationship with nature would also serve to make us better humans. Okay, Wallace Stegner, who will read the very last day of class, would say that it would make us good animals. Our current attitudes toward property and nature are stultifying. They really are. Our current attitudes toward property, toward non-human animals, nature, are stultifying. They make us into emotional and spiritual cripples. These attitudes encourage greed, competitiveness, and an urge to conquer. They discourage love. They discourage a sense of connection, right? Apathy and indifference are celebrated. To be able to get away from the view that nature is a collection of useful, senseless, and rightless objects is deeply involved in the development of our abilities to love. To be able to reach a heightened awareness of our own and others' capacities in their mutual interplay. To do so, we have to give up some psychic investment in our sense of separateness and specialness in the universe. Stone also maintains that this new conception of humanity's relationship with nature is more consistent with objective truths about nature that biological and ecological sciences have disclosed. Remember my primitive little chart up there with all the different animals and the humans and then the cloud for the atmosphere and all that, right? And all the arrows in between, and each arrow depicted a universal law pertaining to relationship. And that universal law also had ecologists instruct us that universal law kind of brings the moral law along with it, at least in the sense that if we do something differently than what we know is the right thing to do for the climate, then we're going to get some disastrous results, right? But, you know, that's kind of what he's saying, right? This new conception, that's kind of a neo-Kantian appeal, isn't it? It's more consistent with objective truths about nature that biology and ecology have taught us about, right? And that makes it more true, right? This new conception of our relationship with nature is therefore more true, right? A few years ago, the pollution of streams was thought of only as the problem of an aesthetic problem, right? Smelly, unsightly, unpotable water to us. Now we are beginning to discover that pollution is a process that destroys wondrously subtle balances of life within the water. This heightened awareness enlarges our sense of the dangers of pollution to us, but it also enlarges our sympathy. Water, the most marvelous substance in the universe probably is water. Just go without it for a few days, and you'll appreciate it. The psychological and sociological benefits continue. Okay? A radical new conception of humanity's relationship with the natural world. He gets kind of hippy-dippy and new agey near the end of his essay. This new conception of humanity's relationship with nature will encourage development of new myths about ourselves and nature, our origins and our future, and these new myths might be more consistent with what scientists know about geology, ecology, evolution, biology, the cosmos, and the emergence of human culture. He suggests, you know, what later on came, he refers to the Gaia hypothesis, right? But it didn't have that name in those days. But this is the Gaia hypothesis, the hypothesis that James Lovelock is the climate scientist who came up with that. Wrote a book about it. The Gaia hypothesis, right? Gaia is the ancient goddess of Earth, I guess. Anyway, but the idea is that the Earth is one organism, of which man is a functional part, humans are a functional part. And Stone is kind of, you know, anticipating that view. As Leopold might say, a new conception of humanity's relationship with nature, inaugurated by a politically codified recognition of legal rights in non-human natural entities, might encourage humans to think like a mountain, think like a river, think like a forest, think like an ocean. All right. And then he makes the dramatic appeal to the Supreme Court, because that's his audience. He wants the Supreme Court, and he knows that Justice Douglas is going to read his essay, but he doesn't know about the other ones. And I don't think they read it. The court is at its best when it summons from the human spirit the kindest and most generous ideas that abound there, giving them shape and reality and legitimacy. In the case of the environment, the court finds itself in a position to award rights in a way that will contribute to a change in popular consciousness. It will be a modest move to be sure, but one in furtherance of a large goal, the future of the planet as we know it. And then, okay, that's a sketch of the Mineral King Valley. Oh, we still have a lot more to go, huh? Anyway, but that's where they wanted to put their resort. It doesn't look like it's that bad, I guess. I don't know, but there was going to be a freeway around in there too. All right, so, all right, we're going to skip through the legal history of this case, but I want to talk a little bit about what happened in Sierra Club versus Morton. So the Mineral King Valley is, as I mentioned, about 150 miles south of Yosemite. It's now included in as part of Sequoia National Park. As I mentioned, this was the conclusion of the case. It was winding its way through. What happened was the Sierra Club's lawsuit was dismissed, right? The court concluded that the Sierra Club did not have legal standing, and therefore the whole lawsuit was just meaningless, was thrown out. But the Sierra Club then went and redrafted their petition, wrote a new petition, and the lawsuit started all over again. So it was bound up in the courts for a total of about 15 years, I think. But finally, in 1978, Congress stepped in and passed a new law transferring Mineral King from the Forest Service to the National Park, and that's where it is today. So this is Justice William O. Douglas's amazing and historic and famous dissenting opinion in Sierra Club versus Morton, which was issued by the United States Supreme Court in 1972. The critical question of standing would be simplified and also put neatly in focus if we fashioned a federal rule that allowed environmental issues to be litigated before federal agencies or federal courts in the name of the inanimate object about to be despoiled, defaced, or invaded by roads and bulldozers, and where injury is the subject of public outrage. Contemporary public concern for protecting nature's ecological equilibrium should lead to the conferral of standing upon environmental objects to sue for their own preservation. This suit would therefore be more properly labeled as Mineral King versus Morton. Okay, and then he points out that inanimate objects are sometimes parties in litigation. A ship has a legal personality. The corporation is an acceptable adversary, and large fortunes ride on its cases. The ordinary corporation is a person for purposes of the adjudicatory processes, whether it represents proprietary, spiritual, aesthetic, or charitable causes. So it should be, as respects valleys, alpine meadows, rivers, lakes, estuaries, beaches, ridges, groves of trees, swampland, or even air. Even air. That feels, these are all ecological wholes, that feels the destructive pressures of modern technology and modern life. The river, for example, is the living symbol of all the life it sustains or nourishes. A little farther along, the river as plaintiff speaks for the ecological unit of life that is part of it. And this is where he wants to draw guardians from. Those people who have a meaningful relation to that body of water, whether it be a fisherman, a canoeist, a zoologist, or a logger, must be able to speak for the values which the river represents and which are threatened with destruction. Okay. Last sentence on this. Those who have that intimate relation with the inanimate object about to be injured, polluted, or otherwise despoiled are its legitimate spokesmen or spokeswomen. Okay. All right, and this is where William Douglas too notices that there are going to be some objections, okay? And he anticipates one of the same objections that Stone discusses, namely that we already have agencies that are assigned the task of watching out for our public resources and our ecological wholes. Yet the pressures on agencies for favorable action one way or the other are enormous. He's saying again, there's too much corruption in the agencies. Even Congress is too remote to give meaningful direction, and its machinery is too ponderous to use very often. The federal agencies of which I speak are not venal or corrupt, but they are notoriously under the control of powerful interests who manipulate them through advisory committees, etc., etc. All right. Okay, so the stirring language of Justice Douglas's famous dissenting opinion. The second bullet point down, the voice of the inanimate object, therefore, should not be stilled. That does not mean that the judiciary takes over the managerial functions from the federal agency. It merely means that before these priceless bits of Americana are forever lost, or are so transformed as to be reduced to the eventual rubble of our urban environment, the voice of the existing beneficiaries of these environmental wonders should be heard. Perhaps they will not win. Perhaps the bulldozers of progress will plow under all the aesthetic wonders of this beautiful land. That is not the present question. The sole question is, who has standing to be heard? All right? And then finally he says, those inarticulate members, like the woodpecker of the ecological group, cannot speak. But those